Let's go ahead and talk Baltimore Ravens. So, the Hall of Fame. So, the stream says we're going to honor and we're going to talk a little about the Hall of Fame tonight. The Ravens. The Ravens, considering the fact that they are a franchise that isn't been around but 30 years. That's not a long time. I'm older than that. A lot of you watching this are older than that, or 30 years old. So I was actually there at the first game at the old Memorial Stadium in '96. I went with my dad and my brother. And so that's a history that's not that long in considering when you always talk about these teams like the Packers and the Bears and the Browns that have been around, over 100 years, almost like going on 100 years now of the NFL. So not even also to AFL teams like the Chiefs and the Raiders, etc., Broncos, that old AFL teams. So you talk about teams with a Hall of Fame, but they have a pretty decent history of guys in the Hall of Fame. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about guys, Ravens that are in the Hall of Fame, maybe the ones you think belong in the Hall of Fame, guys who currently maybe have a shot at the Hall of Fame, Ring of Honor, and jersey retired. As far as that goes, we're going to talk a little bit about OTAs, obviously, today as starting. Not a whole lot with OTAs, but we're going to go over a little bit as well. Go over, obviously, and baseball summer starts. So let's talk about the Ring of Honor. So what is that? So the Ravens Ring of Honor is their version of the Hall of Fame in M&T Bank Stadium in Baltimore. So the Ring of Honor is the group of guys that are honored by the team in stadiums, in games, and everything like that. So let's go ahead and get you squared away. The list is full of Colts. Obviously, Marshall Yanda's there. I think he's the latest one. But there's a lot of they also, too, with the Ravens, they don't honor the Ravens. They honor the entire Baltimore football history. So we talked about that, the Baltimore football history. And it's not just the Ravens, but you talk about I'm a little bit too young for the Colts, I guess. The Colts left in '83, and I think it was '83 or '82. So I really don't remember Colts games. As far as that they were just leaving the long period. But if you talk about guys older, there was a long Colts history, and was talking about Art Modell wanting to honor the history of the Colts. So there's a lot of Baltimore Colts in the Ring of Honor. So some names, like maybe like you younger fans aren't familiar with Raymond Berry. Raymond Berry was an outstanding coach for years, great Baltimore Colts player as well. Art Donovan is a Baltimore treasure. Art Donovan, I think, I never watched him play, obviously, but he was about as very similar to Tony Saragusa in terms of played the same position, defensive tackle. But Art Donovan would show up on David Letterman's show, and he was on Channel 13 for years. He's always had something funny to say. I don't know if you watch Art Donovan analysis, you ever watched a game, but Art was great. A great spirit of the game, represented the Colts for years. So Art Donovan was there. John Mackey was an announcer in Baltimore for years. The original Ravens announcer, some of you might remember that, along with Scott Garceau, great running back for the Colts. One of the best running backs, I think, in the history of the NFL, along Gino Marchetti. Also, too, look, you talk about guys like Gino Marchetti, one of the great Baltimore Colts. Lenny Moore. Lenny Moore was a Baltimore staple. Lenny Moore had a restaurant down there in West Baltimore for years. Lenny Moore, that was one of my mom's favorite players, Lenny Moore. Great Jim Parker was there as well. Jim Parker was, again, played with Art Donovan on the defensive line, one of the great players. And I think one of the top 5 best quarterbacks of all time, the great Johnny Unitas. Also in the Ring of Honor, Ravens now. So we had talked about Marshall Yanda. Jamal Lewis, I think, is the best running back in the history of the Baltimore Ravens. Michael McCurry was on that Super Bowl, one of the best defenses of all time, Super Bowl winning. Thank you. The only reason I'm even here right now, we're having this conversation about Baltimore Ravens, is because of Art Modell. I think Art Modell, shout out to Art Modell in the Ring of Honor. Obviously, Brian Billick. Brian Billick was the head coach of the success the Ravens are having even right now. The started with them hiring Brian Billick. So shout out to, obviously, John Harbaugh has been coach for a long time, but Brian Billick in '99 taking over was the really got the ball rolling with the success of the franchise. Haloti Ngata, a lot of thought on Haloti Ngata. We'll definitely talk more about him, but Haloti Ngata, Ring of Honor, missing the Hall of Fame, I think, a little bit, but Haloti Ngata is there. Matt Stover, I don't think he was as good as Justin Tucker, but Matt Stover, I think, was a phenomenal field goal kicker as well. T-Sizzle, no question about it. Suggs, I think, maybe the greatest pass rusher in the history of the Ravens, maybe one of the greatest pass rushers in the history of the NFL. No question about it. Even more obvious here, Ray Lewis, I think the greatest middle linebacker in the history of the NFL. Jonathan Ogden, maybe the best offensive lineman, offensive tackle, certainly in the history of the NFL. The greatest ball hawk in the history of the league, Ed Reed. Those are easy as well. I think we already talked about Billy. Peter Boulware. I think, again, you talk about Brian Billick. It's fitting with him because a guy that turned things around. The Ravens weren't very good their first few years. They've had a long track here since really '99 of unprecedented success. And one of the guys that got the party started was really Peter Boulware, drafting him early, really building that great defense in the 2000s. Ernest Biner, this is actually the one I think that's more of a Cleveland Browns holdover. Played for the Ravens, good Ravens contributor. Honored. I think Ernest Biner, outstanding. I think no problem honoring Ernest Biner in the Ring of Honor. Todd Heap. They used to yell it every time he used to catch the football downtown. So there is your Ring of Honor as well. Who might get in to the Ring of Honor? We can all agree Lamar Jackson should get into the Ring of Honor, even if he retired today. Interesting what people thought about Lamar if he retired to now. There was mostly thinking that he should get into the Hall of Fame. We'll talk about that. Marlon Humphrey, potential Ring of Honor. These are players that are on the active or contributors that are on the active. Pat Ricard, bit of a long shot, but there's no fullback. I think you could argue he's the most successful fullback I think the Ravens have had. You could argue that at least Ring of Honor. Eric DeCosta's not in. Eric DeCosta's definitely getting in. He's been a Raven since '96. He actually worked with the first. He's been a Raven since the beginning. He's been a general manager ever since Ozzie Newsome retired. Worked underneath Ozzie Newsome as a scout, as a assistant GM, director of college scouting. And so there's no question about it. EDC is going to be in. John Harbaugh, I think the only reason he hasn't been is because he's still the coach. I think the second he leaves the field, no question about it. Ronnie Stanley, I think, is definitely one. And obviously, Ronnie Stanley, I think, is probably not for Jonathan Ogden, the greatest contributor there. And Steve Bisciotti, I think, can't put yourself in. It'll be at some point, but Steve Bisciotti, I think, is, as far as owners go, has had as much success as anyone. So no question about that one. All right. This is very interesting. The jersey number retirement. We're going to talk about this spot retires. So I actually looked this, and I assume that some of these numbers were retired when I researched this. 52, 20, etc. So the Ravens do not have any retired jerseys as a team. None. So what they have is unofficial retired jerseys. So their jerseys, what we have, the best way to explain it is, this was lifted recently. Cal Ripken Sr. for years had a moratorium on his jerseys, right? So what's a moratorium? A moratorium is we're not retiring the jersey, but we're not using it because we expect it to be retired at some point, right? They want to not retiring Cal's jersey Cal Senior's jersey because they gave it to Jackson Holliday. But a lot of times when they put a moratorium on a jersey, you're doing that to retire a number. The Ravens, however, have not officially retired any numbers, right? So all these numbers right now are quote unquote unofficially retired. I don't understand this. I've seen a couple teams with this. The craziest one to me with unofficially retired numbers was Terry Bradshaw. That's like crazy. Terry Bradshaw's jersey is not retired in Pittsburgh. That's insane. Like Terry Bradshaw hasn't played football in 40 years. I don't even remember Terry Bradshaw on the field. I think it was 82 or 3, like since he's played. So you've had a moratorium on 12 for that long. That's crazy. Anyway, but that's what the Ravens do. For whatever reason, they haven't retired. So these are the unofficially retired numbers. Ray Lewis, 52, Ed Reed, 20, Jonathan Ogden, 75, Terrell Suggs, 55, Marshall Leanda, 73, Johnny Unitas representing the Colts, 19. Very interesting story there. The first year the Ravens played 96, it was Scott Mitchell as the quarterback coming over for the Lions. He wore 19. And a lot of the old Baltimore Colts fans lost their mind. What is somebody doing in Baltimore wearing number 19, Johnny Unitas? After Mitchell left, it hasn't been worn since. So there's going to be no number 19. I don't understand why you just don't retire the number. Like Scott Mitchell's been gone since 96. You haven't anyway. But I'm not saying I agree with it or I understand, but this is what they're doing. So these are the numbers. I'm assuming whatever it is, criteria that they're going to be retired. And the league does discourage jersey number retirements. They don't want, because they want to sell jerseys. They don't want to just, honor it, whatever. Sometimes Jackie Robinson in baseball, his number is retired for all teams. There are certain jerseys that are retired, but again, unofficially retired. Those are the unofficially retired jerseys. Okay, so these are all the guys who have ever worn a Ravens uniform in Hall of Fame. Okay, yes, I'm counting the ones that wore it for a short time. Ray Lewis, greatest middle linebacker of all time. I was actually there in Canton for that. Me and my family actually went to Canton when Ray Lewis went into the Hall of Fame a couple years ago. It was a good experience. About a 6-hour drive there. We all went to Canton, the Hall of Fame. It was a great experience there. We went there for that. Jonathan Ogden is retired. Yeah, Ed Reed is in the Hall of Fame as well. Deion Sanders, not known as a Raven, but definitely played for the Ravens, is in the Hall of Fame. Shannon Sharp, there's a line there with Shannon. Shannon, I think, might be the greatest free agent acquisition in the history of the Ravens. Helped the Ravens win a Super Bowl. Same with Rod Woodson. You could argue if that is, again, more known as a Steeler. But Rod Woodson, obviously, I think he's one of the greatest safeties in the history of the Ravens. And Devin Hester's in the Hall of Fame. Devin Hester, I think, very short tenure with the Ravens. Devin Hester, greatest, I think, kickoff returner, punt returner in the history of the NFL. No question about it. Okay. So who's retired but not yet in the Hall? So it's going to be similar to guys that are in the Ring of Honor. Jamal Lewis, I think, is very underrated for the Hall. If you got Jerome Bettis, you certainly should have more consideration for Jamal Lewis. Very similar backs, very similar numbers, but Bettis is already in, but there's no Jamal Lewis. Michael McCrary, I think the sack numbers almost there, so I think it is possibility he gets in on the veterans. Art Modell absolutely should be in the Hall of Fame because he was the only reason he's not in. They hate him in Cleveland because he actually moved the team, so that's the reason why he's not in. Brian Billick, I think, is a bit of a long shot, but his win-loss record, I think, deserves consideration. It is possible he gets in at some point. Haloti Nada, I think I asked this question on Twitter. Should Haloti get in? Interesting. I think Haloti, I saw a lot of Hall of very good with Haloti. Some said yes, some said no. That might not get you in, but very close with Haloti. Haloti, I think also the problem, defensive tackle, I think, might be one of the harder positions to get in. It just is. It's kind of like guard You really have to have won a lot of awards to get in as a tackle or as a guard. It's hard. Matt Stover, I think, isn't in. I think, again, a long shot, but I think some consideration. Terrell Suggs, I'm surprised he didn't get in on the first ballot. I think at some point for sure, Terrell Suggs goes ahead and get in the Hall of Fame. Marshall Yanda, I think it's a matter of time as well. Didn't get in on the first ballot with Suggs. I think he gets in. Steve Smith, former Raven, I think definitely could get in at some point. D. Mace and Weddle, I think it's a bit of a long shot. I think they might have to wait for Veterans Committee. Numbers are actually possibly Hall of Fame worthy. It's there. And Anquan Bolden, I think may get in. I think a bit of, again, not necessarily for sure, but I think it's possible. Matt Burke, I think is possible as well. I think definitely you look at all his accolades, most Pro Bowls of any player, I think, for the Ravens, I think outside of Jonathan Ogden. He didn't get them all with the Ravens because he played a lot of years in Minnesota, but definitely. And I'm going to put him in the retired category because he's no longer this. But when I asked if Justin Tucker get in the Hall of Fame, it was unanimous. The GOAT Justin Tucker to get in. Interesting to see with everything that happened, how it still goes. Current players, I think it's possible in the Hall of Fame. Lamar, I think, gets in at some point. Flacco, I think, is a little closer than what people think. I think like this second career he's had, post Ravens, Denver, Colts, etc., Browns again. I think the numbers are creeping up close to the Hall of Fame. Derrick Henry, I think, cemented his place last year, more known as a Titan, but Derrick Henry, boy, I think it's going to be hard to keep out. Andrews, I think, has to keep going a little bit with better numbers. I think it's going to be harder for him. Interesting, these next 3 years are going to be very key for him as far as getting in. More of a longer shot. I think Roquan Smith also is on the track for the Hall of Fame to get in. A few of the names I didn't put yet, like Kyle Hamilton, Tyler Linderbaum, a little too early for that in those cases. But these guys have had bona fides as far as a longer career as far as the Hall of Fame. There you go. All right. So that's our Hall of Fame discussion in terms of guys who could get in the Hall of Fame. I think it's fun. I think it's a good thing to look at to see what the guys that are going to get into the Hall of Fame have a chance, Ring of Honor. I think the retired jerseys thing really blew my mind. I kind of almost didn't even put that in the second. And the more I researched it was unbelievable. It was really strange that there's no officially retired jerseys by the team. Wow. So there you go. Hall of Fame Ravens. Next week, kind of keeping with this theme, we're going to talk about the top 20 NFL players of all time. So who is the best 20? See if any Ravens make that list or more than one. So we're going to talk about that. Once we get done with that next week with football, we're going to kind of get more back into back into the Ravens, particularly as far as the current squad. We're going to talk about training camp battles,